Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Destry Jarvis. I'm Vice President of US ICOMOS, that is the United States National Committee for the International Council of Monuments and Sites. We foster the World Heritage Program and work closely with our federal partner, the National Park Service, in developing and fostering the World Heritage Program, which today consists of 24 sites in the United States. To open our session today, we had a full session yesterday, which I hope many of you also were able to observe and participate in through Q&A. Today, our focus is on Indigenous peoples in the United States, World Heritage and social justice. And our opening speaker, our plenary speaker, is Dorothy FireCloud. She is a Sicangu Sioux, Rosebud Sioux tribal member. She is a lawyer, University of New Mexico graduate, has been a career professional with the National Park Service, and in her time has been superintendent of 3 units of the park system: Devil's Tower National Monument, Montezuma's Castle National Monument, and Tuzihoot National Monument. Those first 2, I have to say, as a little aside, Devil's Tower and Montezuma's Castle are misnamed. And at some point in the hopefully not too distant future, they should be renamed to more accurately reflect their heritage and the culture that surrounds them. Dorothy has just recently, within the past month, been appointed by the acting director of the National Park Service to be the permanent career professional Native liaison assistant to the director of the National Park Service in the headquarters. And we are most pleased to have you with us, Dorothy, and look forward to your remarks. When she finishes her opening remarks, we'll have a question and answer session, which I will monitor and offer the questions that we receive to Dorothy. So please use the Q&A block at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, to enter your questions. Thank you. It's all yours, Dorothy.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's my honor to be with you here today. You know, as Destry mentioned, I'm a member of the Sicangu Lakota who live in the state of South Dakota in the United States, homelands of the Hopi, Apache, Yavapai, Zuni, Pima, Maricopa, and Atum, who all lived in the Verde Valley of Arizona at various times in the past and used the area as a major trade route between coastal, Southwest, and Plains tribes. The Verde Valley to this day still has what remains of over 800 pueblos, varying in size from a few families to several hundred inhabitants. The valley is currently tribal homelands of the combined Yavapai and Apache nations. I am currently teleworking from my home here in the Verde Valley until sometime next spring, when I will be relocating to our Washington, D.C. office. Excuse me. As Destry mentioned, you know, I worked as superintendent at Macho Tipila, which is known as the Lodge of the Bear, or more commonly Devil's Tower National Monument. And shortly after I arrived at Macho Tipila, I remember one afternoon I was driving out of the park and I was going to go home, and I noticed that there was a bus entering the park. And as it passed, I noticed that it was from St. Francis Indian School, where I had actually attended school for a year when I was 9 years old. It made me really happy to see that the school had brought students to the tower. So I turned my vehicle around and I followed the bus up to the main parking lot. Because it was the end of the day, the parking lot was fairly empty. The bus driver had parked at an angle to allow the students and chaperones to get out close to the trailhead. I parked behind them and went over to say hello, and I them in my uniform. I went up to the bus to say hello. However, when I got to the door, my reception wasn't as I had hoped. I was immediately met with apprehension as they only saw the uniform and the authority that it represented. The bus driver began to tell me that they were unloading and that he would be moving it shortly. I told them, no, I just wanted to say hello and to let you know how happy I'm here, I am to see that you're here. And, I'm from Rosebud. I'm a former St. Francis Indian School student. And you could see the relief coming over them. But what it did was it made me acutely aware of how tribal people feel when coming to places that they had used for centuries for ceremonial and cultural purposes and that are now managed by the federal government. And it was not a good feeling. I continue to hear stories from tribal people of how uncomfortable and unwelcome they felt when having to explain their purpose to park rangers when visiting sites that required entrance fees. Several times I had gone into parks myself for ceremonial purposes and experienced the same type of unwelcoming interactions. In my new position, it is my vision to make a difference in how tribal people and National Park Service work together. I am hoping it will be a time of positive, sustained change. The National Park Service is beginning to hold discussions on the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We will host listening sessions with tribes to gather their views and comments on how they would like to be involved, how they wish their story to be told. It will be a difficult story at best for tribal people to share, as the history has not been positive. So, what have tribal people's experiences in the ideal of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Especially when you read the entire Declaration of Independence and its list of grievances against the King of Great Britain, the last being that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. The Declaration of Independence holds an entirely different story from the perspective of Native American people. During the presentation yesterday on social memory and generational transition, Dr. Pascal Turavinga stated that it was critical to have the political prisoners tell their own stories while providing tours of those sites. No one knows the story better than the political prisoners themselves. They lived and they breathed the story. It is critical here as well that the Indigenous people of this country tell their own stories. I am positive that we will hear horror stories, stories of triumph, stories for which we will shed tears, and stories which we will celebrate. It is a story of attempted genocide, a story of abuse of Native American children at the hands of priests, nuns, and teachers who ran the numerous Native American boarding schools that were located throughout the United States. Once genocide failed, it becomes a story of relocation as a means of termination. Then it becomes a story of self-determination, but mostly a story of resilience. When you visit National Park Service tribal cultural sites, you may see signage which states, "We are still here." Then it goes on to tell stories of tribal people who have been associated with that particular park from their current personal perspective. Many of these stories reflect the past as how it relates to that site, but it normally will not go into anything that is outside the purpose for which the site was established. On the interpretation of civil rights sites panel yesterday, it was impressive to see the African American National Park Service superintendents, because who better to lead those sites? It is their story, their people, their ancestors. It is in their DNA. They feel those stories. They can relate to those stories on an entirely different level than anyone else can. It is the same for tribal people and their connections to tribal cultural National Park Service sites. There was a question that was posed to the panel. How is the National Park Service remembering legacies of other civil rights activists, those who were not the superstars? It made me reflect on those same civil rights struggles and successes of Native Americans. It is an important story of this country, yet there is not one National Park Service site dedicated to this segment of American history. Until that site is established, it must be told as a postscript to other tribal stories. Actually, we do come close with one, Alcatraz. It is one of the last places you would consider when thinking of civil rights of Native American people. But Alcatraz Island, a unit of Golden Gate National Recreation Area, holds two very important tribal stories. The first is the little known history of Hopi people and their struggle to protect their children. In January 1895, the United States government arrested, tried, and shipped 19 Hopi to Alcatraz. Their crimes being that they refused to farm in the ways that the federal government instructed them, and they opposed the forced removal and education of their children in government boarding schools. Both offenses were part of widespread Indian resistance to United States policies that were designed to erase each of the tribe's language and religion. The Hopi were ordered to turn over their children, some as young as 5 years old, to government authorities. The children would then be taken to boarding schools that were located many miles from home. The Hopi, as many other tribal people, heard reports of the children being beaten for speaking their native language, practicing their religion, and other such infractions of boarding school rules. The Hopi were confined as prisoner in the barracks that were located in the basement level of the prison for almost 9 months before being released on September 23rd, 1895. The second story is the occupation of Alcatraz Island by a large group of Native American people beginning in November 1969 and lasting for approximately 19 months. At one point, there were over 400 tribal people who were living on the island. Richard Oakes, a Mohawk iron worker who was the leader of the group of people that were there, stated that Alcatraz is not an island, it's an idea. That idea being that the occupation would symbolize tribal self-determination, tribal rights, and tribal sovereignty. Richard Nixon was president at the time, so during the occupation, he signed 52 legislations into law. What he did was to shift the official government policy from termination to self-determination, a change as significant for Native Americans as the civil rights were for African Americans. So although Alcatraz may have been lost, the occupation gave birth to a political movement which continues to the present time. The park rangers at Alcatraz have done an exceptional job in telling these two stories. The park is currently hosting a 19-month virtual exhibit, which began in November 2019 and is entitled Red Power on Alcatraz, Perspectives 50 Years Later. If you go to the Golden Gate webpage, there's a short video and stories of the occupation that are done very well. I traveled to Alcatraz a few years ago when the park was preparing to repaint many of the structures on the island as they were suffering from ravages of saltwater. As you may have seen in photos, or if you visited the island, there are hundreds of signage left by the people who occupied the island. The short video on the park website has some great photographs of the occupation signage as well. And the park arranged for all of that signage to be restored once the painting was completed. As that moment, the occupation is now an important part of the island's history. And even with all of the laws that were signed by President Nixon during the occupation, it would take another 10 years for Native Americans to enjoy the same guarantees as other Americans under the First Amendment. It was not until 1979, with passage of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, that the act protects and preserves for Native Americans their inherent right of freedom to believe, to express, and to exercise traditional religions, including but not limited to access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and freedom to worship through ceremonial and traditional rites. This act impacted how the National Park Service sites, and for that matter, how the vast majority of federal lands were managed. Because with the ability to openly practice traditional ceremonies being restored, the issue of having access to those sacred places where those ceremonies had been performed arose, and many of the sites were no longer within tribal ownership. This was a critical factor as tribal religious practices are tied to the land, which itself is thought to be a sacred living entity. Those sacred sites are often the focal point of a tribe's creation stories or part of their oral histories, which are passed down from generation to generation and tie new generations to their culture and their identity. One of my favorite quotes about management of sacred sites, which I feel puts our jobs as federal land managers in perspective, is from former Devil's Tower National Monument Superintendent Deb Liggett, and her reflection in a documentary about the struggle to protect sacred sites. She said, "What we are accommodating here at Devil's Tower is Indian people's rights to their culture. They are here for the long haul and they know it. These sacred sites are central to the perpetuation of their culture. One of our jobs here at Devil's Tower is to protect that right." And another story which is currently being researched at Montezuma and Castle and Tuzagoot is that of Indian slavery. This particular story pertains to one of the Yavapai Apache Nation ancestors who was lost to their people. She was only 2 years old when her small tribal group was attacked and all of the adults murdered by United States soldiers. A soldier picked her up, took her to the nearest town, and sold her to a local family. There were stories told by local tribal members back then of seeing her kept in family until she became an adult, but she never returned to the tribe. When people think of slavery in the United States, they do not think of tribal people. However, it was common practice, so common in fact that laws were written specifically to deal with these slaves. One being that the tribal slaves could not remain with the owners past their 18th birthday. In fact, here in Arizona, there is at least one of these laws that is still on the books. Now, going back to my earlier questions on telling the tribal stories in relation to the Declaration of Independence, we all know these stories and others need to be told, but how will they be shared? It all depends. It depends on what tribal people will want to share with us and which of those shared stories they will want us to share with others. In my humble opinion, the National Park Service is beyond doubt the best federal agency to work in. There is a connection with tribes. The National Park Service mission is to preserve and protect all of our sites. This fits well with that of tribal, traditional, social, and ecological knowledge. It also serves as an excellent foundation for establishing win-win partnerships, a couple of which I will highlight briefly. First, the National Park Service provides exceptional opportunities for tribal youth to become engaged in our parks while working on some tremendously awesome projects with ties to their cultural stories. One of these currently is the White Sands National Park Fossilized Human Tracks. Through consultation efforts, the staff at White Sands has established a connection of these human and surrounding animal tracks to centuries-old oral stories of the associated tribes, and the park is looking to hire tribal youth for seasonal positions to work on this project. How awesome is that? Recently, the National Park Service, through the Secretary of Interior, released draft guidance on the Indian Youth Service Corps program for public comment. The program will offer tribes and other partner organizations the ability to enter into agreements with the Secretary of Interior, the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Secretary of Commerce by providing direct hire authority for tribal and Hawaiian youth through conservation work crews, resource assistant positions, and apprenticeships. Tribal youth programs can have such a powerful impact on the lives of those who participate. So the more young people we can get involved, the better. I am personally aware of several tribal youth who worked either in seasonal positions for the National Park Service or with conservation crews, and it truly helped them to decide to make the National Park Service a career, which is the ultimate win-win. There's another awesome tribal partnership being worked on at the Grand Canyon, a World Heritage Site. The staff has been collaborating with tribes in development of the Desert View area of the park. It will be a destination area and will provide visitors with a unique cultural and educational experience. Janet Balsam, Grand Canyon Acting Communications, Partnerships and Exterior Affairs Manager, is on the first panel this afternoon and will give a detailed presentation on the project. It is my hope, though, that the visitor experience at Desert View will become the norm at National Park Service sites and not be unique for very long. I would like to end my talk today with a couple of stories of change, how tribal people are being welcomed to National Park Service sites. First, a tribal woman, along with an elder and her family, were traveling to Devil's Tower to pray and to leave some prayer ties. As she approached the entrance kiosk, she spoke of her hesitancy, as she would have to explain to the ranger why she was there, and because of prior bad experiences, wasn't looking forward to the exchange. She pulled up to the kiosk, told the ranger she was there for ceremonial purposes, and reached to show him the box of prayer ties that had been prepared. However, before she was able to do so, the ranger welcomed her and waved her in. She drove into the park and was so overcome with emotions that she pulled over to the side of the road and wept. She wept with relief and she wept with happiness. She hadn't been interrogated and instead had been welcomed. The other is about the World Heritage Site, Mesa, Verde. A friend and I visited the site not long ago. As we arrived at the gate, my friend pulled out her tribal ID and showed it to the ranger. She's a member of the Kewa Pueblo, which is formerly known as Santo Domingo. And in return, the park ranger said, "Welcome home," gave her a park brochure and waved us in. And I have heard from others, I have heard others tell of this ranger and how welcoming he is. Two simple words, yet so powerful. Welcome home. And thank you for sharing your time with me today.
Dorothy, that was really wonderful. I think we all learned some things there that can be useful to all of us and help the Park Service move ahead with its relationships with Native Americans. One thing that the Park Service began several years ago, I'm wondering if you have any further amplification of, is adopting a regulation that allows tribal people to gather traditional plant materials in national parks that were associated with their culture. Great Smoky Mountains National Park is one that has done that. I'm wondering if you have any other examples or look for other opportunities so that tribal people can return to gathering traditional products in the parks.
Yeah, Swirl National Park down in the southern Arizona has entered into an agreement with Tohono, and it's for gathering of the flowering swirl so that they can use that for traditional purposes. And then there's one other part of the plant that they are also able to gather. And then they can go in and take ribs from some of the swirl plants that have, or swirls that have dropped and have died. And then they're able to use the ribs of the swirl plant to fashion the tools to then reach up high enough to gather the flowers off the swirl plants. And Bahia Calderas in New Mexico is talking to quite a few of their tribal partners as well into and entering into those kind of agreements.
That's great. So,
and I know Yeah, one of the things I think that we need to look at is to try to make it a little bit less cumbersome than what it is. I've heard a lot of complaints, both internally from Park Service staff as well as tribes, and they would just like to get the process a little bit easier to get through.
Sure. Well, that's something that you can play a role in your new job. Looking forward to working with you on that.
Yeah.
One of the later panels today is a group of international leaders that are in countries that have moved ahead of or beyond where the US is with regard to their indigenous people in areas of what I've referred to as co-management or co-governance of traditional places that happen to be federally owned in those countries. I'm wondering if you see opportunities here in the US for the Park Service to advance that agenda in places that are culturally associated with particular tribes.
Yeah, you know, the opportunities are there. And that's something that the tribes have talked to the National Park Service a lot about. The former National Park Service Director, John Jarvis, had actually signed Director's Order 100, which was on resource stewardship in the 21st century. And the tribes were really pleased with that when it was passed and had really looked forward to being able to work with the Park Service on several of the different issues. However, because it was signed so close to the end of the Obama administration, it was rescinded not long after the new administration came in. So, you know, there's possibilities of, you know, there are aspects of the order which had been worked on before the director of the Park Service signed it. And so we've continued to kind of work along on some of those things. But I think with, you know, with maybe the new administration coming in, that there's possibilities of getting a lot more of that back into the policies within the National Park Service.
Right. A lot of parks have embraced tribal engagement in interpretation to visitors in various ways. And some of it is, some of it, at least in the past, was, I would classify more as entertainment and not with much depth. But I think there's opportunities today to advance that program into more sophistication, more direct telling of their own stories in really informative ways. Do you see any examples or opportunities for that in the near future?
Well, yeah. And, you know, the project that I was talking about that's being done with the tribes at Grand Canyon and what Janet will talk about on the next panel, that's an excellent opportunity. And that's why I said, you know, I'm really hoping that once other parks see what Grand Canyon has done, and I mean, they're going to have tribal artisans and tribal people there on a daily basis. And it's going to give the visitor the ability to actually speak with them. And I think learn the educational aspect of it will be from the tribal people themselves. So it's going to be a really nice destination area of the park.
That's great. One last thing, you know, there's another example, another World Heritage Site park is Redwood National Park on the north coast of California. And their culturally affiliated tribe is the Yurok people, whose reservation is on the Klamath River. There have been some overtures made in recent years between the Park Service and the Yurok tribe to develop more cooperative management opportunities. One of them that I thought was wonderful, but also flawed, the tribe traditionally carves whole log redwood canoes, and there's some really excellent carvers. But there's a lack of redwood logs to do that with. And the Park Service had a policy for a while that said if a redwood tree blows over in a storm and it happens to fall over a road and and therefore have to cut it to clear the road, the tribe could have the piece of the log equal to the width of the road to carve a canoe, but that was too short for the kind of canoes that they carve. So I think some more thoughtful engagement to have the Park Service learn a little better what the real traditional values and practices of tribes are as they engage tribes more in sharing their culture would be a good thing.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Before I worked with the National Park Service, I worked with the U.S. Forest Service. And the tribe would also approach the Forest Service about the possibility of getting those logs. And so I think there might be an opportunity to partner with both the Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, and the tribe. And Redwood has actually entered into a self-governance agreement with the tribe. And so, you know, they're working at different opportunities to work with them. And so, you know, I'll look into that and see what we're able to do.
Terrific. Well, I think our time is about run out, Dorothy. This was a wonderful presentation. We thank you very much. I look forward to working with you more regularly again when you're back in Washington. And we will be staying in touch. Appreciate it very much.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
And everybody, the next session will begin in about 10 minutes. You have to go back to your login information and reapply to activate your access to the next panel. We look forward to seeing you there shortly.